What if I told you there once existed an empire so powerful, so rich, and so sophisticated that even mighty Rome called it a rival, not an enemy to conquer, but a force to fear? And what if the fall of that empire would set the stage for one of the most transformative events in human history, the birth of Islam? Welcome to the world of the Sasanian Empire, a realm of fire temples and silk roads, of immortal kings and endless wars with Rome, where emperors claimed divine glory and armies fought beneath banners of eternal flame. For 4 centuries, it stood as the glittering heart of Persia, a civilization of poets, scholars, and warriors who believed their empire was the axis of the world. Yet, within a single generation, it would all come crashing down. But how could such a mighty empire, wealthy beyond imagination, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, vanish so completely that even its memory faded into legend? This is the story of Rome's eastern rival and the road to Islam. So sit back, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the ancient world forever. The fire rekindled the rise of the Sasanian Empire. Have you ever watched an empire die only to see another rise from its ashes, fiercer and hungrier than before? Imagine a crumbling world, once ruled by glory and gold, now swallowed by chaos. The great Persian Empire of Oldhome, of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes was gone. In its place stood the Parthians, weary and fractured, their power dissolving under the weight of time. And yet, somewhere in the deserts of Persis, a new fire was kindling. It began, as all revolutions do, not with the clash of armies, but with a man who refused to kneel. His name was Ardashir, the son of a local priest from a small town called Istakrist, a whisper away from the ruins of Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Achaeans. Every day, Ardashir would gaze upon the blackened stones of that once great palace, where fire altars had gone cold and kings had fallen silent. To others, these ruins were reminders of defeat. To him, they were a promise. By the early 3rd century, Persia was a land divided. The Parthian Arsacid kings ruled loosely, their empire stitched together by feudal lords and rival princes. Their soldiers were horse archers, deadly but disunited. Their capital Ctesiphon glittered with luxury but reeked of decadence. To Rome, they were no longer terrifying rivals, they were a fading nuisance. But deep within Persis, a small spark defied the darkness. Ardashir saw what few dared to believe, that Persia could rise again, united under a single flame, the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda, god of light. They say ambition burns brightest in the shadows of ruin. Ardashir began by consolidating local rule, first under his father Papak, who served as a temple guardian of the Zoroastrian faith. But where Papak was cautious, Ardashir was bold. He trained soldiers, struck alliances, and proclaimed his own divine right to rule. When his older brother took the throne of Persis, Ardashir did not bow. He rebelled, overthrew him, and seized the crown. That was 208 C. The year the old world began to tremble. Word spread quickly. Here was a man invoking the memory of Cyrus the Great, calling himself King of Kings, a title not uttered in Persia for half a millennium. He carried not only a sword, but a vision, to cleanse the world of false kings and restore the order of Ashadavine truth. He wasn't just fighting for power. He believed he was fulfilling a cosmic duty. Rome, at that time, was ruled by emperors who had grown weary of the East. Caracalla had once dreamed of conquering Persia, only to be murdered before he could cross the Tigris. His successors preferred diplomacy to conquest. They sent envoys and gold to keep the Parthians content, never realizing the Parthians themselves were already crumbling. In 224 CE, Ardashir confronted the last Parthian monarch, Artabanus IV, in a decisive battle at Hormuzd. Imagine the scene, the desert air thick with dust, the clash of armored cavalry, and the sun beating down upon banners of fire. When the fighting ceased, Artabanus lay dead, his royal diadem torn from his head. Ardashir stood, victorious, and a new empire was born. He rode into Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. There, beneath vaulted halls lined with fading mosaics of past kings, he performed an act unseen for centuries. He reignited the sacred flame of Ahura Mazda. Witnesses said the fire burned so bright that night turned to day. The Sasanian Empire had been born not from conquest alone, but from faith and fire. Ardashir's rule was more than political. He believed himself chosen by the gods to restore the divine order of the universe. He built fire temples across Persia, revived Zoroastrianism as a state religion, and carved his triumph into rock reliefs at Naqsh-e-Rustam, where old Persian kings slept in stone tombs. In those carvings, Ardashir is shown receiving the royal diadem from Ahura Mazda himself, while the defeated Parthian king lies trampled underfoot. It was not just propaganda, it was theology turned into empire. But as Ardashir consolidated his rule, one thought haunted him. The west, beyond the Euphrates, stood Rome, vast, restless, and watching. The new emperor, Severus Alexander, sent a letter half warning, half mockery, urging peace. Ardashir replied, not with words, but with armies. Within a decade of his coronation, Persian banners crossed into Mesopotamia, and fire altars were raised in Roman lands. It was the first act in a centuries-long duel that would define the East. The Romans were stunned. For nearly 500 years, Persia had been a fractured memory, a legend buried under Parthian dust. Now, suddenly, a new Cyrus had arisen. But this Persia was not the tolerant, multi-ethnic realm of old. It was sharper, more focused, forged in the fires of faith. To the Romans, it felt like facing a ghost of their oldest rival, reborn with vengeance. And yet, Ardashir's expansion was only the beginning. Behind him stood a figure even more formidable, his son Shapur. If Ardashir was the founder, Shapur was the conqueror. Together, they forged an empire stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Central Asia, and from the Indus Valley to the gates of Antioch. Their armies bore elephants, cataphracts, and banners that shimmered like living flame. But Shapur would take the struggle with Rome to new, terrifying heights. He would not only fight emperors, he would capture one. The young Sasanian prince was everything his father had hoped for: bold, cunning, and relentless. He studied Rome not to admire it, but to dismantle it. When Ardashir died in 241 CE, Shapur ascended the throne under an omen. A comet streaked across the Persian sky, leaving behind a trail like a flaming sword. Some saw it as a sign of divine favor. Others whispered it was a warning. Rome, meanwhile, had descended into chaos. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century had turned emperors into marching shadows, rising and falling with dizzying speed. Civil wars erupted, plagues spread, and frontier legions mutinied. Shapur saw opportunity. He invaded Roman Mesopotamia, capturing key cities like Carrhae and Nisibis, and defeated Emperor Gordian III near the Euphrates. Rome's eastern legions were shattered, their standards seized. But the true shock came years later. In 260 CE, when Emperor Valerian himself marched east to reclaim the lost lands. It would be a disaster that still echoes in history's memory. Picture it: 2 emperors face to face, the Roman, in his silvered armor, dulled by dust and defeat, and the Persian, resplendent in gold, his eyes like burning coals. The battle near Edessa ended in catastrophe for Rome. Valerian's army was annihilated, and the emperor was captured alive, the only Roman emperor in history to be taken prisoner. The world could scarcely believe it. Roman chroniclers wrote that Valerian was humiliated, forced to kneel as Shapur mounted his horse. Persian inscriptions, carved deep into cliffs, depicted Shapur holding the Roman emperor by the wrist, as if presenting a trophy to the gods. For Rome, it was a wound that would never fully heal. For Persia, it was divine vindication. Yet Shapur's triumph contained the seeds of peril. His empire had grown vast, too vast. His victories brought wealth, captives, and glory, but also resentment and exhaustion. The Zoroastrian priesthood grew powerful, intertwining religion and politics, so tightly that kings began to rule as much for the gods as for their people. And while Persia celebrated, a quiet storm was rising within its borders. New beliefs, Gnostic sects, Manichaeism, and Christian communities were spreading, questioning the fire temple's authority. The Sasanian world, though glorious, stood upon a knife's edge. By the late 3rd century, the Romans had recovered. Under Emperor Diocletian, they reorganized, fortified, and struck back. A fragile balance emerged in uneasy peace that stretched from the Tigris to the Mediterranean. But this peace was not born of trust. It was born of exhaustion. The Sasanians had proven that Rome was not invincible. They had rekindled the Persian flame and made the East burn bright again. Yet, beneath that brilliance, shadows gathered. Kings grew suspicious, priests grew greedy, and nobles plotted behind palace walls. And far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, unseen by both Rome and Persia, tribes whispered of a new message, a call that would soon reshape the entire world. But that, as we'll soon see, was still beyond the horizon. For now, Persia stood tall, imperial, divine, and unbroken. But every flame, no matter how sacred, carries the risk of burning itself out. And in the next chapter, as Shapar's descendants take the throne, the empire will learn that the brighter the fire, the darker the shadow it casts. The empire of fire and silk, the glory in the shadows. Have you ever seen a civilization so radiant, so full of art, power, and pride, that you could almost feel it teetering on the edge of its own brilliance? That was the Sasanian Empire in its prime, a world of silk and steel, of divine kings and cosmic balance. The fire temples burned brighter than ever. The roads pulsed with caravans from India, Byzantium, and China. Gold coins stamped with the faces of kings shimmered in every marketplace. And yet, behind the majesty, something dangerous was growing, a tension between faith and power, destiny and pride, that would soon decide the empire's fate. After Shapar's victories, Persia stood unrivaled in the east. No empire since the Achaemenids had stretched so far or ruled with such ambition. Across its vast lands, from the Caspian shores to the Arabian sands, everything bore the mark of the Sasanians' elegant stone carvings. Silver cups etched with royal hunts, and cities planned with mathematical precision. To live under the Sasanian crown was to live in a realm that believed itself divinely ordered, a mirror of heaven, ruled by the king who was God's chosen shadow on earth. That king, after Shapar, was Bahram I, a ruler, both pious and uncertain. His court shimmered with scholars, mystics, and priests, but also trembled under their power. Zoroastrianism, once a unifying flame, had become an instrument of control. The Magi, the priestly class, now dictated law and truth, interpreting every omen, every whisper of the sacred fire. To question them was to defy the gods themselves. But in this age of shining orthodoxy, one man dared to question everything. His name was Mahony. Born around 216 CE in Mesopotamia, Mahony was a visionary who claimed to unite all faiths, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism, into one universal truth. He preached that light and darkness existed in every soul, and salvation came not through rituals or priests, but through understanding. His followers, the Manichaeans, spread swiftly from Persia to Egypt, carried by traders and thinkers who longed for a gentler faith. Mahony himself stood before Bahram I, speaking of peace, unity, and enlightenment. For a moment, it seemed Persia might embrace him, but the Magi saw a threat greater than any Roman legion. Manas' teachings undermined their control. His words carried a fire they could not contain. They convinced Bahram that Mani was dangerous, a heretic whose ideas would dissolve the empire's sacred order. And so, One night, Mahani was seized, imprisoned, and executed, some say flayed alive. His skin hung outside the gates of Ardashir as a warning to all who dared defy the divine flame. The empire had silenced him, but his message lived on, whispering through the ages, a warning that too much faith in divine order could consume the very light it sought to protect. As the 4th century dawned, Persia glittered like a jewel at the center of the world. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Ambassadors from China, India, and Rome crossed its borders. Scholars gathered at Ardashir, where Greek medicine met Indian philosophy and Persian astronomy. In its libraries, men wrote of stars, souls, and science. It was, in many ways, a golden age. But the kings of this age, Bahram II, Narsa, Yazdegerd, I ruled in uneasy harmony with the priests and nobles who shared their throne in spirit, if not in name. The empire's wealth was vast, but its unity was fragile. Rome, now reborn as the Byzantine Empire, watched closely. The two giants faced one another like mirrors, each proud, ancient, and convinced of its divine destiny. Then, around 363 CE, that mirror shattered. The Roman Emperor Julian, called the apostate for his rejection of Christianity, launched a massive invasion eastward. He marched across the Euphrates, intent on crushing Persia once and for all, to avenge Rome's humiliations under Shapur. His army of nearly 65,000 men advanced swiftly, burning towns, sacking fortresses, and reaching the walls of Ctesiphon itself. The Persian capital trembled. But Shapur II, the reigning Sasanian monarch, was no ordinary foe. He was cunning, patient, a master of delay. Instead of meeting the Romans head-on, he ordered his cities evacuated, his supplies burned, and his fields flooded. Julian's legions, confident but hungry, found themselves stranded in an alien land of marshes and heat, surrounded by invisible enemies. Persian cavalry circled like hawks, striking at night, vanishing by dawn. The Romans starved. Their emperor grew desperate. During a chaotic skirmish near Samarra, Julian was struck by a spear, the wound fatal. His dying words, according to legend, were bitter and strange. "You have won, Galilean." The Romans retreated, defeated not by battle, but by exhaustion and fear. For Persia, it was a triumph that restored its pride and its borders. For Rome, it was a humiliation that deepened its divisions. And yet, even in victory, Persia was changing. Shapur II ruled for 70 years, longer than any Persian king before him. Under his reign, the empire reached the peak of its territorial power, stretching from the Arabian desert to the Caucasus. He was called Shapur the Great, and his court was a spectacle of gold and glory. But his reign also saw a darker side: fierce persecution of Christians, seen as allies of Rome's new Christian emperors. Thousands were martyred, churches burned. The fire of faith consumed both mercy and assent. When Shapur II died, the empire mourned a legend and awoke to uncertainty. The 5th century brought wars, alliances, and betrayals in equal measure. The Byzantines strengthened, learning from defeat. New powers arose in the north: the Huns, wild riders from the steppe, whose raids shook both empires to their core. Persia found itself caught between worlds, too civilized to retreat, too proud to bend. Yet out of this turmoil rose a new kind of king, Khosrow I, called Anushirvan, the immortal soul. When he took the throne in the 6th century, Persia was weary from centuries of war. Khosrow dreamed not of conquest, but of order. He reformed taxes, built canals, and welcomed philosophers exiled from Byzantium. He made Ardashir a beacon of learning, where Greek physicians taught alongside Indian astronomers and Persian mathematicians. Under his reign, the Sasanian Empire became not merely a realm of kings, but a cradle of intellect. It is said that under Khosrow, Persia knew a kind of peace no one had seen before. Roads were safe, markets busy, and justice swift. Even foreign chroniclers, Roman and Arab alike, called him the most just of kings. Yet peace, as history always warns, carries its own illusion. For while Khosrow built his golden age, the world around him was shifting in unseen ways. Far to the west, the Byzantine Empire was regaining strength under Emperor Justinian. His dream was to restore the old Roman world, to bring back the empire's glory. To do that, he needed Persia subdued or contained. What began as diplomacy soon turned to rivalry, and once more, the ancient cycle resumed. The two empires clashed, not just with swords, but with faith, ideology, and pride. Their wars drained their treasuries and shattered their borders, even as they fought in the name of divine truth. And in those same years, on the fringes of both empires, in the deserts of Arabia, small tribes began to trade more widely. To speak of new prophets and old gods, few noticed, few cared. But from these humble sands would soon rise a force neither Rome nor Persia could imagine. When Khosrow died, his heirs fought bitterly for power. Civil war erupted. Brother turned against brother, general against priest. In 1 decade, the empire went from brilliance to chaos. Assassinations became daily affairs. Thrones changed hands faster than crowns could be forged. By the early 600s, the mighty Sasanian Empire, heir of Cyrus and guardian of fire and faith, was cracking, and yet, before it fell, it would blaze one last time, in a war so vast and terrible that it would exhaust both Persia and Byzantium, and leave the world open for something entirely new. But that is a story for the next chapter, when the Empire of Fire meets its final trial, and the road to Islam begins to unfold. The War of Empires. Persia's last great blaze. Have you ever witnessed two titans locked in combat, so evenly matched that their struggle becomes a slow suicide? That was the fate of Rome and Persia in the 7th century. For centuries, they had stared across the frontier, trading blows and truces, fire and gold. But now, for one last time, they would fight with everything they had. The war would last a generation, burn through nations, and end with both empires gasping for air. And from their ashes, a new world would emerge. The stage was set in the early 600s, when two kings, Khosrow II of Persia and Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium, rose to power amid chaos. Both inherited broken worlds. Both believed they were chosen by God to restore order. Both would drive their people to the edge of ruin in pursuit of glory. Khosrow II, grandson of the great Anushirvan, was a ruler of immense charisma and ambition. His crown gleamed with gems, his robes shimmered like flame. At his court in Ctesiphon, ambassadors from India, Arabia, and China knelt before him. He saw himself not merely as king, but as the savior of the Persian world, the final torchbearer of divine fire. Yet his rise to power had been anything but divine. When he first took the throne, Persia was fractured by rebellion. The Byzantine Emperor Maurus had actually helped him reclaim his crown, marching his armies east in a rare moment of alliance. In gratitude, Khosrow swore eternal friendship with Rome, a vow that would soon become one of history's great ironies. For when Maurus was betrayed and murdered by his own general, Khosrow's fury ignited. He claimed vengeance, not merely as duty, but as destiny. "I will avenge my brother," he declared. Though Maurus had been Roman, not Persian, it was a brilliant excuse for conquest. In 602 CE, Persia's legions swept across the Roman frontier. Armenia fell first, then Mesopotamia, then Syria. Cities burned, temples looted, and entire populations vanished into slavery. Persian banners bearing the royal sigil, the winged son of Ahura Mazda, fluttered above Roman fortresses. The Empire of Fire was spreading once more, and this time it seemed unstoppable. By 613 CE, Khosrow's generals, Sharbaraz and Shahin, were advancing deeper into Roman lands. Antioch, Damascus, and Jerusalem fell in quick succession. In Jerusalem, the Persians seized the holiest relic of Christendom, the true cross. It was paraded through Ctesiphon in triumph, while priests offered sacrifices in its honor. 2 Christian chroniclers. It was an apocalypse, the end of the old world. To the Persians, it was divine justice. The gods of light reclaiming their due. And yet, even as he celebrated, Khosrow could not see the trap forming. Rome had found its own savior, a wiry, sharp-eyed emperor named Heraclius. At first, he seemed doomed. When he took the throne, the Byzantine treasury was empty, Constantinople half in revolt. Persian armies were closing in from the east. Avars and Slavs pressed from the north. Heraclius even considered abandoning the city and fleeing to Carthage. But something inside him refused. "If God is with us," he said, "then even the desert will become our sword." He began by reorganizing everything: taxes, armies, even faith itself. He melted down church treasures to pay soldiers, called upon priests to fight as chaplains, and promised heaven to those who defended the cross. Then, in 622 CE, Heraclius did the unthinkable. He marched east, not to defend, but to attack. The Roman counteroffensive was like nothing the Persians expected. Heraclius didn't fight set-piece battles. He moved fast, striking supply lines, ambushing outposts, and vanishing into the mountains. For years, he waged a campaign of deception and endurance. Slowly, the balance began to shift. In 624 CE, Heraclius marched deep into Persia itself, desecrating fire temples and burning sacred cities. The Persians, who had once carried the true cross in victory, now watched their own holy sites crumble in smoke. The divine flame flickered, and doubt spread. Khosrow, consumed by pride, refused to negotiate. He executed generals who suggested retreat. He trusted omens, not advisors. In one brutal winter, Heraclius invaded again, this time allying with the Turks from the north, a move no one thought possible. The combined forces smashed through Persian defenses. In 627 CE, at the Battle of Nineveh, the armies of the 2 greatest empires clashed beneath gray, frozen skies. Imagine it, the fields slick with frost and blood, the air filled with the clang of steel and the roar of dying men. Heraclius fought like a man possessed, cutting through the Persian ranks himself. Sharbaros, Persia's greatest general, watched in horror as his army broke. When the sun set, tens of thousands lay dead, and with them, the illusion of Persian invincibility. Khosrow fled to Ctesiphon, but his empire was unraveling. Provinces rebelled, nobles turned traitor, priests grew silent. Finally, his own son, Kavad II, led a palace coup. The once golden king was dragged from his chambers, imprisoned, and executed, his body thrown into a well. The fire had devoured its own keeper. The war that followed left both empires shattered. The Byzantines regained their lands, even recovered the true cross, which Heraclius returned to Jerusalem in solemn triumph. But victory was hollow. The empire's coffers were empty, its armies broken, its people starving. Persia was worse, its cities in ruins, its priests discredited, its throne a revolving door of weak kings and assassins. In the span of just a few years, the Sasanian world collapsed into chaos. Between 628 and 632, more than a dozen kings and princes claimed the crown. Assassinations became routine. Power passed like a curse. The once mighty empire of fire, the equal of Rome, was now a ghost of itself. And then, at that very moment of exhaustion, something extraordinary happened, not in Persia, not in Rome, but in the deserts to the south, in a place few had noticed. Among tribes dismissed as backward and poor, a new voice was rising. A man named Muhammad was preaching the unity of God, a message that transcended tribe and blood. His words carried across the dunes like wind through flame. gathering strength with each echo. In 632 CE, the prophet died, but his followers, united and disciplined, began to move north. They were small in number, yet they carried something neither Rome nor Persia could understand: faith, unshaken by empire, unburdened by decadence. When they reached the borders of the two exhausted giants, they found no resistance worthy of their zeal. Roman and Persian armies, weary from decades of war, could barely lift their swords. Cities surrendered without siege. Entire provinces, weary of taxes and corruption, opened their gates. At Caucasus, in 636 CE, the Arabs met the Persians in open battle. The river ran red for days. Elephants trampled men into mud, while chants of Allahu Akbar echoed across the plains. When the dust cleared, the Sasanian army was destroyed. A few years later, the Persians made their final stand at Nahavand and fell again. The immortal empire was dead. Ctesiphon, once the heart of the Persian world, fell silent. The sacred fires burned out. The royal diadem of Ardashir and Shapur vanished into history, but from its ruins, something new took root. The Persian spirit, its language, its poetry, its memory, did not die. Instead, it merged with the rising tide of Islam, shaping the caliphate's culture, art, and science for centuries to come. Persian scholars would translate Greek wisdom, write epic poetry, and build cities that glowed like stars in the Islamic Golden Age. And so, the empire that called itself eternal had fallen, only to become immortal in another form. But before that transformation could truly begin, there remained one final mystery: how the fire of Zoroastrianism, thought extinguished, continued to burn in hidden corners of the mountains. A flame passed secretly from hand to hand, kept alive by those who refused to let the old gods die. And in the next chapter, we'll follow that flame from the ashes of Ctesiphon to the dawn of Islam, and the rebirth of Persian identity beneath a new sky. The Phoenix of the East, Persia's fall and rebirth under Islam. What happens when a civilization dies but refuses to vanish? When its heart is pierced, its temples shattered, and its kings forgotten, yet its soul keeps breathing. That was the fate of Persia after the fall of the Sasanian Empire. The armies of Islam had conquered its cities, toppled its crown, and extinguished its sacred fires. But in truth, the Persians were not defeated, they were transforming. The old empire was gone, yes, but its essence was being reborn, quietly, within the very faith that had replaced it. It began with silence. After the Battle of Nahavand, in 642 CI, the victory of victories. For the Arabs, the Sasanian world ceased to exist as a political power. Yazdegerd III, the last Sasanian king, fled eastward, first to Media, then to Merv, carrying with him what remained of royal dignity and divine fire. He was only a boy when he ascended the throne, a fragile remnant of an age that no longer believed in him. Everywhere he went, he begged for loyalty from governors, nobles, and priests. But loyalty had evaporated. Each promised help, then abandoned him. Persia was exhausted. Yazdegerd wandered through his once great realm like a ghost, haunting his own palace. The temples were looted, the silver dirhams melted, the fire altars cold. Even the nobles, descendants of those who had sworn oaths to Ardashir and Shapur, now bowed to the new rulers, the caliphs of Arabia. In 651 CE, after years of flight, the last king of kings met a quiet, tragic end. A local miller, bribed by Arab soldiers, murdered him beside the river in Merv. The miller's axe struck not just a man, but an aged end of 1,200 years of imperial Persia. And yet, Persia did not die. Something extraordinary happened in the years that followed. The conquerors did not destroy everything. They couldn't. The Arabs brought a new faith, a new language, and a new world order, but they needed Persia to govern it. They needed its scribes, its taxmen, its engineers, its scholars. They needed its wisdom. And so, slowly, something remarkable began. The conquered started shaping the conquerors. The Umayyad Caliphate ruled from Damascus, spreading Islam across the Middle East and North Africa. But while their armies carried swords, their bureaucracy carried Persian ink. The tax systems, postal routes, and administrative practices that sustained this vast new empire were not Arab inventions, they were Sasanian legacies. The very paper that recorded the caliph's edicts bore the echo of Persian order. Even the title vizier, meaning minister, was born from Persian governance. The Persians, pragmatic and proud, adapted. Many converted to Islam sincerely. Others did so for survival. But even those who changed their faith kept their identity in their hearts. Their fire temples became mosques. Their sacred hymns turned into poetry. Their devotion to divine truth reshaped into Islamic philosophy. Zoroastrianism lived on quietly among the mountains of Yazd and Kerman, its priests guarding secret fires that had burned since Ardashir's time. Hidden shrines glowed in the desert, where the faithful whispered old prayers beside new ones. Meanwhile, the Abbasid revolution in 750 CE, born partly from Persian support, brought a dramatic shift. The Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, moved their capital to Baghdad, and opened their doors to Persian administrators and thinkers. For the first time, Persian culture began to rise again, not as a kingdom but as a civilization reborn under Islam's banner. The empire of the sword was giving way to an empire of the mind. Baghdad became the center of the known world, a city of libraries, palaces, and observatories. The House of Wisdom, a grand institution of learning, gathered scholars from every corner of the caliphate. There, Persian translators rendered the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen into Arabic. But in truth, the spirit behind this intellectual revolution was Persian. They had once served kings of kings. Now they served the Caliph of Islam, yet their mission was the same: to preserve and illuminate knowledge. One name stands out among them: Ibn Sina, to the west as Avicenna, a Persian born near Bukhara in 980 CE. He became one of the greatest minds in history, writing the Canon of Medicine and the Book of Healing, works that shaped science for 1,000 years. Another was Al-Farabi, the philosopher who revived Greek thought in the Islamic world. These men were not merely scholars, they were heirs to the Sasanian dream of cosmic order and divine wisdom, now reborn through reason and faith rather than empire and fire. And there was poetry. Always, there was poetry. In the city of Tus, centuries after Ctesiphon had fallen silent, a man named Abul Qasim Ferdowsi began writing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It took him 30 years, in nearly 50,000 verses. He resurrected the entire Persian past, the mythical kings, the heroes of legend, the wars of gods and men. His words rekindled a flame that history had tried to bury. "The world will long remember my name," he wrote, "for I have revived Persia through this book." And he was right. When the Shahnameh was recited in royal courts, tears filled the eyes of Persian nobles who had long forgotten their ancestors' names. The caliphs themselves, seated on golden thrones, listened in awe to the story of Rustam, of Zahak, of the mighty empire that had once stood before Rome. Ferdowsi's poem was not rebellion, it was resurrection. Through art, Persia reclaimed its soul. Even the Arabic language, dominant and sacred, could not suppress Persian expression. Soon, Persian became a language of poetry and philosophy once again. Spoken by the elite of the Islamic world, from Samarkand to Isfahan, the Sasanian flame had changed form. It was no longer fire in temples, but light in minds. Yet beneath this cultural revival lay a deeper truth. Persia had never been fully conquered in spirit. The faith of Islam, profound and unifying, became not a foreign religion, but a Persianized one. Persian mystics shaped its heart through Sufism, turning spiritual devotion into art. Men like Rumi, Attor, and Hafez transformed faith into love, doctrine into music, and theology into poetry. Through them, The Persian soul became universal. Still, in remote valleys and forgotten villages, Zoroastrian families clung to the old ways. Each night, they tended small flames in clay lamps, symbols of Ahura Mazda's eternal light. They had no empire now, no kings, no armies, but their faith endured, quietly, stubbornly, for over 1,000 years. And even today, that flame still burns. By the 10th century, Persia was no longer an empire of borders, was an empire of culture. Its influence spread into the heart of Islam, shaping architecture, literature, governance, and art. From the palaces of Baghdad to the domes of Samarkand, Persian design and thought defined the very image of Islamic civilization. The conquerors had conquered land. The Persians had conquered time, and yet, for all its rebirth, something restless remained, a whisper of its imperial past. The memory of the Sasanian kings never fully faded. Centuries later, when dynasties like the Safavids and Samanids rose, they looked back to Ardashir and Shapur for legitimacy. Their banners carried not only the crescent of Islam, but the sunburst of Persia's eternal fire. The idea of Persia, the land of order, wisdom, and beauty, proved indestructible. But every rebirth brings new tensions. Persia, though thriving under Islam, began to dream again of independence. Its poets spoke in riddles of kings reborn, of hidden glory waiting to rise. And in the next century, the dream would take shape once more in the form of dynasties that claimed both the heritage of the Prophet and the legacy of the Persian kings. In the next chapter, we'll see how the Persian soul, reborn through Islam, would rise yet again, this time not as an empire of conquest, but as one of faith, art, and identity that would influence the world for 1,000 years. The eternal flame, Persia's legacy, and the dawn of a new world. Have you ever wondered how a nation could die twice and yet live forever? Persia had lost its kings, its armies, its throne of gold, but what remained was far greater than any empire of marble and steel. It was something invisible, yet indestructibly spirit, that no conquest could erase. By the dawn of the second millennium, the Persian heart was beating again, quietly shaping a new world beneath the banner of Islam. What began as survival had become transcendence. Centuries had passed since the last Sasanian king fell by the river in Merv. The caliphate that had once ruled from Damascus now rested in Baghdad, gilded and weary. The Abbasids, once fiery revolutionaries, were now figureheads surrounded by scholars, poets, and viziers, many of them Persian. The empire of faith had become, in all but name, Persian at its core. Its administration ran in the Persian tongue, its courtly manners followed Persian tradition, and its vision of kingship drew from the Shahanshah, the king of kings. But history never rests for long. In the east, the Samanid dynasty rose in the 9th and 10th centuries, a dynasty both Muslim and proudly Persian. From their capital, at Bukhara, they ruled in the name of Islam, but revived the Persian language as the voice of art, diplomacy, and law. They sponsored poets, scholars, and scientists. Under them, Persian script was reborn, not the old Pahlavi of the Sasanians, but a new Persian written in Arabic letters, the language of the Quran. The two civilizations had finally merged, not in war, but in harmony. It was under the Samanids that Ferdowsi completed his Shahnameh, and when he finished, legend says he carried the manuscript to the royal court, expecting gold equal to his art. Instead, the king, distracted, ungrateful, rewarded him with a mere bag of silver. Broken-hearted, Ferdowsi left the palace. But history has its own justice. Centuries later, kings would build monuments in his name. His verses would be recited beside campfires, and mosques, and marketplaces. He had given Persia back her memory. His stories of Rostam, Sohab, and Zahak were more than myths, they were blueprints of identity. Every Persian child who heard them could feel the pulse of an empire reborn in words. Through poetry, Persia had achieved what its armies never could: immortality. But even as Persian culture bloomed, The world around it was shifting again. The Mongols swept down from the steppes in the 13th century like a storm of fire and ash. They destroyed Baghdad, slaughtered millions, and burned libraries that had stood for centuries. The House of Wisdom, that treasure of human knowledge, went up and smoked the ink of 1,000 scrolls, blackening the Tigris. For a moment, it seemed the flame would finally go out. Yet once again, Persia rose. Out of ruin came rebirth. The Mongols, who conquered Persia, soon became Persianized themselves. They learned its language, adopted its customs, rebuilt its cities. Under the Ilkhanids, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz flourished once more. Persian architecture blossomed into domes that seemed to float like stars. Miniature painters illustrated scenes from the Shahnameh with colors brighter than fire. Even conquerors, it seemed, could not resist becoming Persian. Then came Timur the Turco-Mongol conqueror, who dreamed of being both Genghis Khan and Cyrus reborn. His empire was forged in blood, but in his capital of Samarkand, he built gardens, observatories, and mosques that rivaled paradise. Under him and his successors, Persian art, calligraphy, and science reached new heights. The Persian spirit, indomitable and adaptive, had turned even invasion into renewal. By the 16th century, a new dynasty emerged that would forever change the region. They united Persia once more under a single banner, not the flame of Ahura Mazda, not the sunburst of Ardashir, but the crescent of Islam. Yet it was not the same Islam that ruled in Baghdad or Cairo. The Safavids made Shi'ism the state religion, carving a distinct identity that set Persia apart from its Sunni neighbors. In doing so, they created not just a state, but a civilization, a continuation of the Persian story, under a new divine light. Shah Abbas the Great, the empire's greatest ruler, transformed Isfahan into one of the most beautiful cities on earth. Travelers called it half the world. Its boulevards shimmered with turquoise domes, its bridges arched gracefully over the Zayanda River, and its bazaars sang with the sounds of poets and merchants alike. It was here, more than 1,000 years after Ardashir's first conquest, that Persia stood reborn imperial again, but in a new way. Under the Safavids, Persian identity crystallized into something enduring. Its poetry found eternal voices in Hafez and Sadi, whose verses spoke not of kings but of love, mortality, and God. Even after death, wrote Hafez, the perfume of my verses will rise from the earth. His words proved true. Persian art, philosophy, and architecture spread from India to Anatolia, influencing empires from the Mughals to the Ottomans. The palaces of Delhi and Lahore glowed with Persian motifs. Persian became the language of diplomacy, literature, and refinement across the Islamic world. No longer a political empire, Persia had become something greater, a cultural superpower, subtle and eternal. And yet, for all its triumphs, the memory of its fall never left it. Every flame casts a shadow, and Persia's was the ache of remembering a time when its kings ruled from the Tigris to the Indus. But in that longing lay its genius, to turn loss into creation, exile into art, faith into beauty. Today, when you stand among the ruins of Persepolis, you can still feel it, the echo of a world that believed itself eternal. The wind carries whispers of Zoroastrian hymns. The call to prayer rises from nearby villages, and between them drifts something that belongs to both and neither. The Persian spirit, still alive, still burning. The story of the Sasanian Empire is not merely one of rise and fall. It is the story of transformation, the metamorphosis of empire into civilization, of conquest into culture, of flame into light. When Rome crumbled, its memory fractured. When Persia fell, its memory became immortal. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Sasanian Empire. Not the walls it built, nor the kings it crowned, but the idea it carried, that order and wisdom, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. The fire that Ardashir lit in the ruins of Persepolis still burns today, not in temples or palaces, but in the hearts of millions who speak its language, dream its dreams, and remember its name. Because Persia did not end, it endured, it transformed. And through every empire that came after, from the Abbasids to the Safavids, from poets to philosophers, continues to whisper one eternal truth. Empires fall, but civilizations endure. And somewhere, in a hidden sanctuary of Yazd, an ancient flame still flickers in the dark, just as it did 2,000 years ago, when a man named Ardashir dared to dream that fire could rule the world.